Hello and welcome to the third lecture in the Brownbag lecture series this fall. Today's speaker is Nate Pickett from Geography, and the title of his talk is on the screen, Doing Social Science Research in Post-Soviet Spaces. And I also would like to advertise all of the Tuesday talks. They will be taking place every single Tuesday at 12, but the next two are in the area of musicology and then film and media studies. So these are our general topics.
Cool. Well, thank you for inviting me back. I was not expecting to be back doing a brown bag so soon, but I always like doing them, so it's never a problem. Today I wanted to talk more about methods that I usually ever talk and that most people usually ever talk about, and specifically in this context of doing social science research in post-Soviet areas. And there will be a big caveat later on about what post-Soviet means, and I don't have research experience in every post-Soviet country, no matter how you want to define that word. But I do have some in one country, and hopefully we'll be able to get some discussion going. I was in Ukraine in the 2015-2016 school year on a Fulbright doing dissertation research on how the production of technoscientific knowledge and information and policy writing and political relationships co-produce each other. So how politics influences the creation of scientific knowledge and how new scientific knowledge influences policy and political relationships. And specifically looking at Ukraine in a post-Chernobyl context. So the Chernobyl disaster happens in 1986. The reactor explodes. A lot of nuclear material is released in the atmosphere and into the environment. And it has a really long-standing effect in the 31 years since then. And so my dissertation is looking at how a society works in the wake of a major technogenic disaster. Technogenic meaning coming from technology as opposed to a natural disaster like a hurricane or something like that. But specifically in looking at the political geographies of Ukraine. So that's sort of the setup there and the things that I'm looking at. I'm looking at biopolitical relationships, so how people and the state interact with each other and how the state regulates people and how people are able to exert power on the state outside of traditional relationships or this traditional top-down power type structure. And also geopolitical relationships, so how Ukraine is relating to its neighbors and international organizations, both on a state level and at smaller, more granular levels too, NGOs, and particularly one very small city, Slavutic, which was built after the Chernobyl disaster to house the workers that still need to work at Chernobyl. And that was the subject of my previous brown bag, which you can find online. So thank you to the people recording and putting them online. So you can find more information on that. I won't really be talking about that today. But I've only got 2 slides today. I've really economized. And the first one is just focusing on methods. And so my project has really these one big question, so how do technoscientific knowledge production and politics co-produce each other, but really looking in 3 sort of specific areas. One on like policy creation, especially, one on biopolitical relationships, and one on geopolitical relationships. It's kind of a broad topic, but the thing that binds it together is this sort of overarching methodological approach that I'm going into the project with. And this is, I put up at the top there, assemblages. So looking at how people, how humans and non-human actors work with each other. So a non-human actor is something that's not a human that nevertheless affects the doings of politics, broadly construed, or how society functions in a particular way. And this comes from the field of science and technology studies, or STS, where non-human actors are taken seriously as things that they have no decision-making power, but these non-human objects can affect how people think about things and the decisions that they choose, sort of bringing a materiality into the decision-making processes that go into making politics work. So that's this general approach. And assemblage is taking these networks of how these humans and non-human things interact, the influences that they have on each other, how decisions spiral out, the institutions that people are involved with, personal connections and how those influence different decisions and people's political agendas. But really taking the materiality of it seriously and into consideration, where I can get into much more deeper if you have questions about it. So the way that I'm collecting all this data, though, because this is just the umbrella, this is how I'm doing it, but the way that I'm getting all my raw data is through those middle 3 points, through archival research, through elite interviews, and through discourse analysis. I think most everyone in this room is familiar with archival research. You go to an archive, you get the files, you take notes on them. Sometimes you can take pictures of them, sometimes you can copy them. But then you get this raw information that was made in the past. You take it out of the historical record and you try to extract information out of it. You notice what isn't written and make inferences about why that information is missing. And you correlate that with what other people have written to make a cohesive story using the raw pieces of history that you can pull out of the written record that are collected in different places. And there's politics to archives, and why is this information in this archive, and who curates this archive, and why did they choose this stuff, and what was behind that, why did they not choose other things, why do I have to go all the way across the country and deal with a whole separate bureaucracy to get a different kind of information, or why is this information not in this country at all. All of these things are sort of baked into the doing of archival research, which I'll also touch on in a second. For my project, especially because I'm dealing with political decision-making people, is why I focused on doing elite interviews while I was doing my fieldwork in Ukraine, specifically talking with government leaders and with NGO leaders to get sort of an insider story of what you were doing and why did you make these decisions. I could have done surveys, but that wouldn't have answered the questions that I wanted to. And the important thing to realize with methods is that you should start with your research questions first and then choose your methods to match those questions to get the information that you're looking for. Don't just start with methods and then have to piece together a question or what information is relevant to pull out of that and make a story out of this information. You can do that, but I found that that takes longer and is less productive than going in with a purpose and looking for things and designing a research project around answering a question that you pose. And I focused on elites because I wanted this class of people that were making decisions. And when I get onto the challenges slide, which is the next one, I'll talk about how successful that was. Spoiler alert, medium successful. But there's a whole host of challenges in doing elite interviews that go beyond just doing interviews with people. And then the third major sort of method in my methodology is discourse analysis, where I look at actual texts of things and looking at the words that are being used and the narratives that they are promoting or proposing or creating, constructing, and what are the component parts of that? Who are the people putting their ideas into these documents? Who are reading these documents? Who are these documents affecting? And so looking specifically at the discourse itself and the words being used as a piece of material evidence, and then also looking at what do you do with this information? How do people and decision makers take this written word and transform it into enacted policy or embodied politics? How does this transformation happen? Because even with the same document, you can have all kinds of different interpretations. Just look at the US Constitution, right? The words don't change, but how you think about them and how you use them to enact certain policies or promote certain political narratives changes over time and context, and who is doing the talking. So those are the general sort of methods in this overarching umbrella of how I approached my project. But I also wanted to talk briefly about researcher subjectivity, because this is something that when I was an undergrad in history, I wasn't really exposed to this concept at all because history was seen as this, you're exploring all of these things that have already happened, and you as a person doesn't necessarily matter because you're just looking at these dead texts. There's a lot of problems with that interpretation, but that's how I received my training in my undergrad. As I moved into social science through the CREASE MA and now in geography, there's been a real heightened focus on recognizing your position as a researcher when you are doing your research projects. Even if they're completely historically based, how do you as a person and your subjective experiences, taking into consideration your age, your race, your nationality, your gender, how do all of these things affect how you are looking at your data, what data you're choosing, and how you are interpreting that? And when you're dealing with people, especially if you're doing research in another country, like people that research this area are, being an American has a certain but malleable cachet to it when you're interacting with your research subjects. Some people are way more open to speaking with an American researcher. Others are very more closed off. And trying to navigate that is a tricky thing. And if you're not aware of those issues ahead of time, you're going to hit a number of stumbling blocks. Also, there was an article that was shared on Facebook. Vitaly, you might have shared it, I don't remember, by a black woman in the academy doing research in the post-Soviet area. And I don't remember her name, unfortunately.
Sarah Valentine.
Yeah, Sarah Valentine. Talked about her experience of going to Russia in the 90s as a black woman and not being prepared for that experience at all. Russians' interactions with black people in general, and gender and misogyny issues that she faced. She didn't have any idea, there was no forewarning going into that she would hit all these roadblocks or have all of these extra things to have to consider. And so in this article she's writing, she's saying that we should be talking about this stuff, especially in a Russian area studies context, because it so often goes unmentioned, your research subjectivity. Besides, well, I think we talk a lot about being an American and going to the former Soviet Union to do research, but not so much talking about your age or your race or your gender, which are important things to consider and think about. As a younger researcher, I found that some people, especially older established academics, were less willing to talk with me than people closer to my age group, give or take 20 years. But I found that this newer generation of academics that started their careers in the post-Soviet era were much more open to working with me and helping me and responding to my emails, which is a major problem for some reason. But actually being on board and being interested in what I was doing was something that the younger half of the academy was into, whereas the older, more established academics, there was a very extreme process of gatekeeping if I wanted to have any access to them and if they were going to be any help and willing at all. So I think keeping in mind who you are and the challenges of that when you're going into this area, which is a huge chunk of the world, and it's going to be variable whether you're in Central Asia or, as a region, there's going to be variations in there depending on your subjectivity, how people relate to you, or whether you're in Russia or Ukraine or the Baltics or even just the bloc, not even the Soviet Union proper. How your subjectivity relates to the political history and the political situation there at the current moment is definitely going to be variable depending on who you are, especially when you are just starting and you don't have any of your own context that you've cultivated. Once you know people and you're able to work through them, then arguably the process gets a little easier. But when you're first starting out, you have to be cognizant of these things and realize that it's going to be harder in ways that you might not anticipate to get the information and to get access to the information of people that you want to. Uh-oh. There we go. Slide number 2 of 2. Also, I just want to point out, both of these pictures were pictures I took of the Vernadsky National Library in Ukraine. The outside is this very modernist, great building, I'm cutting off like the top 4 or 5 floors of this picture. It's very wide also. And then inside this big tower thing, when you walk in, you're assaulted with this mural, and it's just fantastic. And it's impossible to get a picture of the entire mural, but it's great. It's, you know, like the history of science and that glorious sort of socialist realist kind of imagination. It's just a great thing. Very striking when you walk into there and you're waiting to get your library card processed. It's very cool. 60s? 70s.
Pretty early in it. Kind of brutalist architecture.
Yes,
Yeah,
basically, in fact, there is a lot of a revival of interest to this late Soviet modernism, and Kiev was one of the places where there were interesting examples of this kind of brutalist to post-brutalist things. But that's a different section. Interruption.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so I want to pivot now to some challenges here, and this is the caveat that I talked about using the term post-Soviet, because you can't just use it unproblematically or without talking about what post-Soviet means. Does post-Soviet have post-colonial implications, like the term would imply, borrowing the post from post-colonial? Is post-Soviet a valid term for the entire former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc? Arguably to different degrees, especially over the past 25 years of independence. Its value as a term is debatable and not set in stone. There are places that are more post than Soviet. There are places that are more Soviet than post. And that's not even just talking about countries themselves, but within them as well. Cities or neighborhoods or even particular people entrenched in institutions and in bureaucracies that have largely remained unchanged. So I use this word lightly, but because it's a really convenient word to use to describe what I'm talking about, that's why I'm rolling with it. But again, this goes back to researcher subjectivity, being aware not only of yourself, but also of your relationship to that place, and acknowledging that there are local and regional and personal differences and agendas and attitudes and ideas and practices that you're going to have to interact with, and you kind of got to think on your feet and be quick to adapt as you need to as you're navigating these institutions and people. So a few challenges to doing any work in the area, and this will be specific to my experience in Ukraine doing the Fulbright. Number one is the bureaucracy. And again, talking Ukraine specifically, a lot has been modernized and changed and updated, and every single institution, government institution in Ukraine is in some sort of transition flux out of how it was in the late Soviet Union. Some have moved on pretty well, others have not. Like the police, for example, are just now in the past few years starting a trend to adopt Western policing practices rather than the more Soviet style, inviting people from the Chicago PD to help train police departments in select cities in Ukraine. This is just one example. Other things remain, as far as I can understand, exactly the same. Registration services and a lot of archives that were established in the Soviet Union still operate on the same rules and regulations and restrictions, and there's no incentive to change that. Why do you need to make it easier for people? Why bother changing it at all? That's just going to cost time and money, and we're fine with how the system is. There's there's always some resistance to change and updates, especially when you're talking these big institutional type momentum shifts. And that's kind of a very frustrating thing to have to deal with, especially because it's so different from institution to institution. So when I was doing my archival work, I wanted to get into a number of archives. One of them was the Slavutich City Archive, which it's a very small town, it's 25,000 people, tiny. And it was like a 3-hour bus ride from Kyiv. And so I emailed the archivists. All their information's online. So I emailed them and said, hey, I'm a researcher, and I wrote all this up in Ukrainian. Hey, I'm a researcher, I'm interested in this type of project, I want to come look at the city archives. I understand that these are your hours, but I just want to give you a heads up, like what are the best days for me to come, when are you going to be available, and if you have any specific files or whatever pertaining to my project, like here's a heads up, this is the kind of stuff I'm looking for. Which you should send to any archive you're going to anyway and work with the archivist there. And they did not respond to my email. I sent them an email in October. And I waited and waited and waited, didn't hear from them. And then I said, you know what, I'm just going to go up there and see what happens. And so by the time I finally get up there, months have passed, and I am in the city administration building where the archive is, and I walk in, I go to the archivist floor, because I was talking with the mayor and doing other things too. So I was like, oh, I'll just go in and stop by the archive. I go in there and knock on the door, and these two women that run the archive were in there. And I was like, hi, this is my name. This is kind of what I want to do. And they went, oh, did you send us an email like 4 months ago? And I said, yeah. And they said, oh, we thought you were fake. I was like, why? Like, if you were going to fake something, why would someone fake going to a city archive? Like, there are so many other things you could fake. Why did you think that was fake? But they had never received a request like that, and it was just completely out of the blue. They didn't know who I was. I had no contacts there. And so they were like, obviously, this is some version of a prank call. So they never responded to my email. But as soon as I got there, they were lovely and nice and gave me all the access I wanted to and took pictures of things for me while I was looking at other files and making copies. And it ended up being great, but I had to go there in person and make friends with them and be polite, and then all of a sudden they were very open.
You didn't do it. You know, a lot of times when you don't get a reply, sometimes they might not have seen it.
Yeah, so I didn't know what the issue was, and so I just was like, well, I'm in the building, I might as well go knock on the door. And it was an hour before closing time, and because it was just one of these tack-on things, like, oh, I have a little bit of time, they should still be open, and they were like, oh, people want to come to our office, here's everything. So that was one example. Another example was working in the SBU archive. The SBU is the successor organization of the FSB. Or the KGB, rather. And so a friend of mine that I met on my Fulbright out there, another American researcher doing his PhD fieldwork, was talking about the whole process of getting your approval and having to submit your passport and getting all the right things and basically giving you like a background check and security clearance to get into the SBU archive. And I was like, okay, so this process is going to take a while. So I started. And it's going, but then they lose my email, and I was like, oh, okay, so now I have to start this whole process over again. And it takes a while, but part of the process there was, what do you want to look at? And I was like, describe your project in detail, so I did. And then when I got there, they arranged an appointment and all these things. There's a big security checkpoint, you have to get buzzed in, and you're led by MPs around. And so I get to the office and I meet with the archivist who's in charge of my case, and she's like, we've prepared a thumb drive with all of the files that you requested. Everything's already been digitized on the subject, so here's a whole group of them, and you just pop it in the computer, see what you need, and then you identify the files you want, bring in your own thumb drive, we'll wipe it, and then you can copy your files over. And I was like, okay. So that was the easiest process. Once I actually got in the door, they were so convenient. Everything, and granted, I'm talking about like the 80s onward, right? So maybe older documents, not so much. You have to get the old musty tomes out. But all of these documents had been digitized already. I had to do no work other than going, yeah, these 29. And then they just bundle them up for me, and they were on my computer. It was absolutely no problem. Whereas otherwise in other archives, sometimes they don't let you take pictures, or you can't snap them with your phone, so you have to handwrite out. And doing that across languages, whether it's direct quoting or you're just referring back to it or collating information, when you only have a limited time because the reading room is only open for 4 hours every 3 days, and can be very frustrating. So to go to the SBU and they're like, here's everything you want. I was like, this is great, awesome, no problem. So it's going to be different no matter where you go, and it just involves a lot of personal contact. Never call, or never email, always call. If you find them on Facebook, send them a Facebook message. Everyone is responsive on Facebook. I did not realize this, and this is getting to the technology point. I was expecting maybe people using like Contact You or other things, but no one responds to emails. No one responds to text messages because you have to pay separately for text messages. But everyone replies on Facebook. And part of that is post-Maidan. Nobody wants to use Kontakte or other Russian-produced things for social communication. So Facebook is huge and exploding because there's free Wi-Fi everywhere. If you have a SIM card on your phone, you probably also have Facebook. So I was like Facebook messaging with the mayor of a city over Facebook, and that was the most convenient way to get a hold of him, because if he was in meetings, he wouldn't take a call, but he would see my message pop up, and because it's free, you don't have to pay for an SMS, he would just reply there. And so the only reason I still have Facebook now is because 3/4 of it are these people I met in Ukraine, and that's the only way I can keep like reliably in contact with them. Because you can change your phone number, but your Facebook profile is not really going to change. So that was a very big surprise with technology when I went there. And I'm not a big fan of cold calling people on the phone, even though you have to do it sometimes. And so Facebook was a surprisingly convenient way. Once I realized that everyone was on Facebook and it was totally normal to ask for someone's Facebook information and to be friends with them, and everyone was doing it with everyone, absolutely no problem. Which kind of gets to the gatekeeping thing too, especially as I found in academic communities was where the more harder gatekeeping was. In the political and NGO communities I was working in, everyone wants to talk with you. They have no problems talking with you. And so once you were able to find someone, you had access to the whole network basically. So there was a real soft gatekeeping. It was just as soon as you get your foot in the door, it swings wide open. Within academic communities though, I felt a lot more resistance. Some people were very excited to work with me and gave me like all of the books that their institution had published on the topic, and it was like more than my suitcase could carry. And other places, like I'd been trying to contact a number of scholars that worked on Ukraine and had been working in Ukraine or Chernobyl for years, and just would never ever respond. By the time April rolls around and they're doing the big 30-year commemoration events, because I was there in the spring of 2016. There's people that I've been trying to contact for months coming out to some of these events, and I would corner them and say, hey, I've been trying to get in contact with you for a while. And they would go, oh, okay, yeah, I remember your name. And if I wasn't able to corner them well enough, they would just walk away, and it was very frustrating. And then so I would have to like work through my academic contacts for them to like actually pay attention to me, and that was a little bit frustrating. But the people that were willing to work with me in the local academic communities were fantastic, and they were great. Very open to wanting to help as much as possible. A number of people were interested in collaborative research. I went to a couple academic conferences in different universities, and everyone was very open, wanted to hear what I had to say as an outsider, and then told me how I was wrong, which is how it goes. But all of that's fine, because you're making these connections and you're meeting all these people in these different departments and growing this network. But again, it was mostly the younger faculty. For me, as a younger person, those were the people that I had access to. So I guess that sort of wraps up my prepared topic.